Thanks, everybody. Today we have Joshua Holbrook, PhD candidate, who did part of it. He's an assistant professor of environmental science in Montreat College, Montreat, North Carolina. So he had a little problem, I think, getting here because he's part of that whole area that got flooded in North Carolina. But at any rate, so he did a bunch of his research, and one of the sites was called Wightman, and so we just asked him if he could present some of his data to us. So, gosh.
Thank you. All right, hello everybody. So like Susan said, I'm coming from Western North Carolina, and we just got Hurricane Helene that hit us, and that was a little rocky. We just got internet a couple of days ago back, and power a day or two before that, so we were without power for 10 days. So I didn't realize this, and you kind of think about it afterwards, but it really helps to have internet to make slideshows. And so I got this done just a couple days ago through no fault of my own, and so I haven't had time to go through the timing, so we'll see how long this takes. Usually when I do lectures, I try to time them somewhat ahead of time, but that just wasn't possible here. But yeah, so I'm working on my PhD with Clemson University, and I'll talk a little bit about what I was doing. But Paul Wightman, as it was one of my sites that was part of a larger network of sites. So I'm going to talk all about what I did everywhere, but then specifically in the preserve, what the lessons were there and some of the species we encountered and that sort of thing. So we're working in isolated wetlands. Isolated wetlands are really, really important for all sorts of things. They are among the most biodiverse and most productive habitats in existence. So by productivity, I mean like how much biomass are they producing? How much energy are they converting from sunlight into living matter? So they were right up there with tropical rainforests and coral reefs in terms of how much food, how much stuff, how much plant matter, how much algae they're creating. And what's really cool for a place like a prairie is that you have all this energy from the sun being fixed, being turned into food in the wetland there, but then you have critters like frogs and dragonflies and various other insects that start their life in that aquatic environment. They're able to skim from that aquatic environment, eat their food there, but then what do? They grow up and they move out into the prairie. And so you have a movement of the energy and of the food from the wetland to the prairie, which is obviously, we'd call that like a subsidy, right? That's a lot of energy that's being provided by these small little isolated things. And that's because it's a lot of light and a lot of water, right? If you're a plant, you're going to be limited by those two things more than anything else. So if you got a lot of light, you got a lot of water, you can make a lot of biomass, you can make a lot of, transfer a lot of energy. So, so because there's so much productivity, there's a lot of biodiversity, right? So if you're an animal and you want to live somewhere, as animals are wont to do, you want to live in a place with lots of energy, because that means it can support more things. That's why the rainforest is so biodiverse, because you have big trees that can convert all that energy into wood and into leaves, and then things can live on the various parts of the trees, and things can live off of those things, and you get the same sort of thing in a wetland system where there's just so much food there that you can have a lot of critters living there. You can kind of you can get like a dip net or something like that, right? So a net with small mesh. Try dragging that net through some grasses, just in an upland, and then try dragging that that net through a wetland. You'll see that there's tons more bugs, tons more just little critters in these wetlands. So a really high biodiversity, and especially in isolated wetlands. So so what I mean by an isolated wetland is wetland you can walk completely around and it's not going to have a connection to another body of water. So mostly as I was driving, down here from farther south in Illinois, there are a lot of wetlands, but they're not all necessarily isolated, right? A lot of them are floodplain wetlands off of the Mississippi and that sort of thing. And so the fact that they're isolated might be important, and that's actually where some of my research came in, but we'll get to that. So specifically at Paul Wightman, what do you guys call it for short? Do you just call it Paul Wightman?
Wightman.
Okay, Wightman, okay. Specifically
This is
at
Father
Wightman.
Paul, by the
And
way.
by the way, yes,
Yeah, yeah. It seems like it'd be confusing. So specifically at Paul Wightman. So particularly here, so you have these isolated wetlands that are formed by karst sinkholes. There's a lot of sort of chemistry that goes into that, but carbonic acid, and basically this sort of wetland is rare some places and really common other places, and by that I just mean like isolated wetlands. So where I'm at in the mountains of western North Carolina, we don't have very many isolated wetlands at all, because we don't have any limestone, we don't have any karst, and we have never had glaciers in recent history. So glaciers, as they're receding, are pulling boulders across the landscape, making little divots, that sort of thing. And also the fact that we live on mountains that are like this is not really good for water staying in one place, as I found out a couple weeks ago with all the flooding. In Wightman, we surveyed 8 wetlands for fish, for amphibians, and macroinvertebrates, and I was asking 2 overarching questions. So we're going to move into the 2 overarching questions and what I found. But these were part of a larger subset of wetlands in Illinois. So I think overall we did 20 wetlands in the state. So 10 of them were up at Fox Ridge State Park in central Illinois, and then 10 sort of in the southern region. And we sampled with these traps out. Look, there's one right over there, so I'll go grab it because they're amazing.
Yeah.
So,
one of our members found this for you.
Yeah, thank you, appreciate that. Sometimes they, yeah. These are, I've used these all over the world because they're amazing. There's actually, so they're a crayfish trap, and there's actually like a brand name version of these called Promars. But these are not that. These are actually, they have smaller mesh than the brand name Promars. And they're kind of cheap Chinese knockoffs, and so we call them Fomars. So, but these are great because they're a funnel trap, so something goes in there, and there's, snake or something goes in, and it's really hard for you to get out, because if you're just taking the path of least resistance, you're just going to run into the wall. So really good for catching everything. As we'll see in a minute, I'll give you some examples, but lots of amphibians, lots of reptiles. So we did about 20 in Illinois, and we were combining that with all the other wetlands that I surveyed since I started in summer 2021, so did 3 summers worth of work in here, Connecticut, North Carolina, South Carolina, Northern Florida, Southern Florida, Peru, and Paraguay. So I have 130 wetlands across all those locations that I surveyed. I actually surveyed more than that, but some of them I had to not use the data from for various reasons. So surveying all these for fish, amphibians, and bugs. I don't know what, there's a line through world there, but these traps catch all sorts of things. So there's Whitney with a siren. We get big fish. We've gotten bigger fish than that. We 10-pound bass at least sometimes. This is in Paraguay. This is a couple of broad-snouted caimans that we got in these traps, and we've gotten gators and stuff bigger than this. So they really just catch everything. They're kind of wonderful. I love these caiman. So the first thing I was looking at is how exactly do fish end up in wetlands like this. So if you, and this is fun because this was like the first science question I ever asked. I remember being like 8 years old and going to the nature center, and they took us on a walk to the pond, and I was like, how are there fish here? And so, this coming to start my PhD, this is kind of, full circle, like, oh, how are there fish here? Like, how do fish actually end up here? And, if you're a fish, you go back to look at some of these ponds. Let's see. right? Fish don't have legs, and so they can't get up and walk. Some of them can. South America, Central America, you have some species that can walk between ponds like this. We're actually getting some of them as invasive species in the United States. In Florida, we have a species called the walking catfish now that can just get up and walk between ponds, which is not good if you're in an environment where you haven't evolved to deal with fish that can walk. But fish do end up in some of these isolated ponds, and so the question is how? If they can't get up and walk, how do they get there? And this has been a question that's been discussed for a long time. Because you can look at it on the small scale, little guys like in the preserved little ponds, but you can also look at a big scale. There are isolated lakes out there. There are isolated watersheds that are separate from one another. So how do things get between these habitats? And so it's been discussed forever, since Darwin, since Wallace, and there are three dominant hypotheses that you'll read if you look at the literature around this. And the first one is birds. In fact, if you go, you can do your own informal survey, talk to your friends about it, like, how do you think fish get in here? Chances are most of them will say birds. I've tried it before. They're like, oh, maybe the birds carry them over. There's a lot of different ways that can work. Your osprey grabs trout, I don't know what would be common around here, bass, right? So, and it accidentally drops it in a lake. That's sort of dependent on the osprey messing up a couple of times, because you need more than one bass for reproduction to occur. But that would be one way. Another way would be if eggs stuck to their legs. Another way would be, they've actually done some experimental work and found that things like cyprinid carp eggs can pass through a bird's digestive tract and still hatch afterwards. So that's a possibility, and that's the most popular possibility that shows up when land managers and fisheries managers are interviewed. Humans also move fish around quite a bit, as you might imagine. So they've done work in, the Sierras of California. They have a long-standing program where they introduce trout into some of these high-elevation lakes where they're a couple miles high, and people have to hike in with fish backpacks, or they'll drop them from airplanes, all to get fish into these ponds that are naturally fishless. I think there was a survey of like 1,400 Canadian fishless lakes that were known historically to be fishless, and more than half of them have fish now, and a lot of that, it's like you get a game species like trout. And then the third dominant hypothesis is landscape flooding. So the fact is that we're not there necessarily when the highest rains are happening, right? You're not necessarily in the field when there's a ton of rain and these ponds are coming up, and some of them might get connected, maybe just for minutes at a time, and fish might be able to move back and forth because of that. So what I was looking at, sort of the big global question is, what explains most of these isolated ponds and wetlands that have fish? Obviously, all three of these things probably happen at different places and at different times, but what's the most common thing? And can we find that out? So, I had these 8 wetlands in the preserve, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, so these are the 8 I surveyed. The next picture is going to be a little bit messed up. It'll have some extra points. So, so there were 2 that had fish in them. Anybody want to guess which 2? Anybody that doesn't know already?
Closest to the road.
Yeah. So there were 2 that had fish. One was this guy right next to the road here, and one was this guy right next to the parking lot. Every other one was completely fishless. Lots of amphibians, lots of bugs, but no fish. And so when I looked at all the data on all my wetlands across North and South America, it seemed like the shape of the landscape was the number one variable that explained whether there were fish in them or not. In other words, you have flatter landscapes, you're more likely to have the floods come, the water spreads out, and you get fish that can move between these wetlands by the new passages that get made. So that's something we would call low landscape heterogeneity. Or if they're part of a larger wetland system, which is also related to how flat it is, right? You're going to have more swampy wetlands that are nearer to each other on flatter landscapes. I should say mid. So in the preserve, there were, I would call it mid-levels of heterogeneity. So there were kind of rolling hills, right? Not super flat if you compare it to if you've ever been to the coastal plain of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida. That's all really flat. But there were rolling hills, and we still had a couple of ponds that were fish dominated though. But going there, even before I scouted any of them, looking at the landscape, I was like, well, most of these are probably not going to have fish, and sure enough, most of them did not have fish. But that raises the question of the two that did have fish, and you can probably guess why based on their proximity, right? So, right next to the road, you can probably cast over the fence here and hit the pond, and then right next to the parking lot were the two wetlands, or the two ponds rather, that had fish in them. And you can get a further guess when you look at the species of fish that were found there. So, white crappie, which is not your largemouth bass, but it's a sport fish that can survive in these really kind of swampy, turbid habitats. And then that's green sunfish were in the other pond. I couldn't find a picture of one of the green sunfish we got, so I threw in that red-eared sunfish as a stand-in. So that is not in fact a green sunfish, but that was the only species in the parking lot pond. So just the fact that these are recreational fish, they're not a tiny fish like mosquito fish, which we got at some of our other sites, is a good indication that these were probably let go by people so that they could have a nice little fishing hole to come back to. So then the next question that comes up is, what does this mean for the other stuff that lives there? Right? So you have fish that live in these ponds and wetlands, but what about the amphibians, the frogs, and the salamanders, and the dragonfly larvae, and the mayflies, all that stuff? And what we know from just fish ecology is that fish are the dominant predators wherever they happen to occur. And so this would be like a trade-off thing. So in ecology, we refer to trade-offs as these things that are like design limitations, right? You can't be big and small at the same time. You can't be both fast and maneuverable. Well, so fish are very adapted to this aquatic habitat, and so what that means is they're limited in their ability to move in other habitats, even the ones that can breathe air, that can walk. They're not very graceful on land, but they do dominate in these aquatic habitats. If you're a salamander, if you're a bug, if you're a frog, your habitat is going to be dominated by fish. You do have some amphibians that can resist fish, that coexist with fish just fine. Usually these are amphibians that have some sort of toxicity in their skin to where they're not edible for fish. And some, so bullfrogs, I think, but also green frogs tend to do better around fish because they're resistant to fish. They're not very tasty, but they're not resistant to dragonfly larvae, which are affected by fish. So when you have fish, the fish eat the dragonfly larvae. The dragonfly larvae don't eat as many bullfrogs and green frogs, and they're able to increase and do better, so to speak. So what we were doing is looking at, both with invertebrates and with fish, looking at the community of the invertebrates and amphibians rather, looking at the community. So in other words, we're not just looking at one species, we're looking at the whole group that occurs there. So we put the traps out in the wetland, and our whole day was just, okay, 2 leopard frogs, or in this case it would be pickerel frog, 3 tiger salamanders, and just looking at the entire group that's there. And then basically comparing those different groups between wetlands that had fish and wetlands that didn't have fish. And so kind of one of the results from this are these guys. This is called a NMDS plot, non-metric multidimensional scaling. That's going to be on the quiz afterwards. So, but what this is they look like a spider, but you can see there are little dots everywhere, and each dot represents a wetland. In this case, this is all of my Illinois wetlands, even central Illinois and southern Illinois. Each dot is one of those wetlands, and the closer they are to each other, the more similar their amphibian community is. In other words, you know, these 2 guys right here probably have mostly the same stuff, maybe different numbers of some of them. Maybe, you know, like this one had 5 tiger salamanders, this had 17, but they both have tiger salamanders and pickerel frogs and eastern newts. The farther they are away, the less similar they are. And so the ones that are grouped by no there are the ones that didn't have fish, and the ones that are grouped by the yes means they did have fish. And if anybody cares during the Q&A, I can give you the statistics. They're up there later, but I don't even really care about the statistics, so those can come up in the Q&A if you guys want to hear about that. But overall, and so this includes the preserve ponds, we had fewer amphibians total, like numbers, and species. So you have fish in your wetlands, and the community changes, and it changes in the sense that you get fewer amphibians and fewer species of amphibians there. And some of them were completely excluded by fish. Like, we never found tiger salamanders in wetlands that had fish in them. We never found great tree frog in wetlands that had fish in them. But obviously, it's not like I hate fish. If you want to manage for high biodiversity, if you want to have a lot of different species in an area, having a mixture, having a mix of wetlands with and without fish is obviously going to promote the most biodiversity on the landscape. And just like we've got going on at the preserve here, right? So we've got those 2 ponds with fish, and there's going to be stuff that can survive there, like the fish, but then you have the ones without fish as well, and all that means a win for the whole area. So some of the amphibians, actually these are all the species of amphibian that we encountered. You know, let's say, well, the trade-off. I was going to say the problem. The trade-off with doing the work the way we did, we were surveying all these sites across North and South America. You can't stay for too long at any one site if you're doing that. And so we get a snapshot, and we're getting all the snapshot at the same time, so it should be a trend that holds true over time. But there are certainly species that occur in these wetlands that we would have missed out on because we weren't serving at the right time. So this is our cricket frog. Here, there should be a note there. So I should have included the adult. The adults are tiny little guys like this. They sound like 2 marbles hitting each other if you've ever been after a rain or whatever. But the tadpoles are, for tadpoles are pretty easy to identify. They're the only one around here with a black tip on their tail. These are tiny little frogs. Then we had tiger salamanders, which are one of my favorite amphibians. I call them mobile attack fish because when tiger salamanders get big, and so we never got one quite that large in some of these wetlands, probably because maybe they dry up more frequently. But when they show up in a wetland, they functionally act the same as fish. They're big predators that eat pretty much everything. So they can't stand to live alongside fish, but they can also get up and move to other wetlands and find more wetlands without fish and eat a lot of the other stuff in there. So they're the dominant predator in the absence of fish. And if you find them as adults, they're pretty common in this region as adults. They're usually a black salamander with yellow spots on them. But as they're juveniles, they'll look quite a bit different. And once again, if you have a pond that's permanent, that's never drying out, that they're breeding in, they will get what's called neotenic, which means they'll basically stay like this their whole life. They'll get gigantic, they'll keep their external gills, they'll keep their, they have kind of an oar-shaped tail, and they'll just live in that pond indefinitely and breed and reproduce there. Because it's a better place to live, right? Living in a pond is better because there's a lot more food, a lot more resources. But if your pond's drying up, it's also good to have that adaptation to be able to become an adult and move out into the world. Bullfrogs, everybody's probably seen these before, but these tadpoles, I said that incorrectly. So they actually have what are called lateral eyes. So in other words, if you were to look at them from the top, their eyes would be on the outside of their body. A lot of other species, they're on the inside of the body around here. And sort of have this tan, sort of yellowish coloration to them. Also get very big tadpoles. And that's so this is actually that roadside pond there with all the white crappie in it. So lots of fish. Also, having fish in there has some downstream effects, like usually the water is a lot dirtier. Just because the fish are eating the herbivores and the herbivores can't eat as much of the algae. So there's whole kind of ecosystem effects to some of these things. Green frogs as well. Green frogs look very similar to bullfrogs, except you can't really see it in this picture, but you would have a fold down the side of the body going from their eardrum, their tympanum, all the way down the side on both sides. Bullfrogs don't have that. But very similar looking otherwise. This one's not my picture. I think I stole it from a friend. But this is pickerel frog, one of a couple species of spotted frog around here, but they're very toxic to fish. I think humans as well, but I've never licked one. But you can tell by the yellow legs there. Then, so we have our eastern newts. So this was actually the dominant amphibian species in the large pond along the ADA trail at the preserve. So lots and lots of eastern newts there. These are also highly toxic. Again, I don't know if they would kill a person, but I've never seen a person eat them, so that's not a really practical answer to have. Although they're western cousins, people have died from eating. I don't know why people have eaten them, but they have. And they have a triphasic life, so they actually have a life where their life starts in the water, then they move up into the uplands for sort of middle age, as they call them Fs. They're these little red and orange guys, and then they move back into the water as adults. And spring peeper, which depending on if there are gopher frogs at the preserve, which I don't know if there are or not, but this is probably the first frog you would hear calling in the spring. So you get those first rains in maybe March, and you hear that's spring peeper. And then I think our last amphibian that we got, was a gray tree frog. So spring peepers are actually a tree frog as well. They're just a lot tinier and have reduced toe pads. But we got some gray tree frogs as well. Usually more associated with forest habitat, but obviously there is some forest in the mix there. Also toxic. If you pick these guys up, don't touch your eyes afterwards. Don't ask me how I know that, but it's kind of like pepper spray, I assume. I haven't been pepper sprayed, but I've been gray tree frog. That's not fun. And then we got all sorts of other stuff as well. So even though they weren't explicitly part of the study, very interested in reptiles as well. So that's kind of my background before I started my PhD. I'm really into both amphibians and reptiles, and wrote a book called The Field Herping Guide, which is all about finding amphibians and reptiles in the wild. And so a lot of turtles, a lot of turtles. We got some babies. So these are red-eared sliders here. They're probably the most common. They're actually an invasive species in a lot of the eastern U.S., but I believe we're in their native range here, so they are supposed to be here. But they kind of get into all these isolated ponds because, you know, unlike the fish, they can't get up and walk. This one right here is a painted turtle, very common turtle as well. Let's see. And the only snake we got, so this is, I believe this is a Midland water snake. They have this very nice sort of patterned belly on them. A lot of the water snakes around here, you differentiate them based on looking at their belly, which is unhelpful for most people, I realize. But for me, you know, you pick them up and it's got a plain belly. So we're actually, my group of students I'm with this weekend, we're camping down at Snake Road in Shawnee National Forest there. So we've been looking at a lot of snake bellies when we can see them. And let's see, so for our invertebrates, I don't know why the crayfish picture's on its side like this, but lots of crayfish. Crayfish are actually extremely important in some of these wetland systems because they're one of the few critters that they can take pretty much anything and turn it into basically a lobster dinner, right? So they're taking all the algae off plants. They're eating any sort of detritus. They really just eat anything. And then they can turn that into something that's a snack for a lot of other animals, like your turtles, some species of snake, and humans too sometimes. And then, of course, there are lots and lots of dragonfly larvae. Now, I love the dragonflies because they are super abundant in wetlands without fish in them, and one of the things people associate, so I'm a wetlands ecologist, and people associate wetlands and swamps and stuff like that with lots and lots of mosquitoes. And actually, these guys are the reason that wetlands themselves usually don't harbor a ton of mosquitoes because they are voracious predators of mosquitoes. So going into a lot of these ponds and wetlands, you seldom ever see mosquito larvae. It's usually around the edges of the swamps and ponds where you get little puddles and they get just completely filled with mosquito larvae, or if you get hollows in trees. But any place that dragonflies can show up, and that's usually wetlands that are going to hold water more than 3 weeks or so, you're going to get you're not going to have very many mosquitoes breeding. And actually, I have, before I get there, since we got time, this is the macroinvertebrates. So in addition to the amphibians, we looked at the insects as well between these sites. And you can see the sites that didn't have fish, they're all very similar to each other. But if you did have fish, you're pretty divergent from everything else. And the way I would interpret that would be, if you have fish in your wetland and you're a dragonfly or you're another spineless creature, it's sort of luck of the draw who survives the fish, whereas the places without fish get taken over by dragonflies and that sort of thing. So backing up now, I had 2 field assistants that helped me out quite a bit there, so David and Reese. David is here in the state today, but did not come here because he's sitting in a chair on Snake Road looking at snakes, and everybody at the Cliffstop staff as well. So that's all I've got for prepared stuff, but I can take any questions if you guys have them. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so now that you've finished your research project, what is your primary hypothesis finding whatever as to how fish are getting into them?
Yeah, it's almost everywhere. So we did some statistical analyses on there's like measures that you can do of landscape roughness, they call it, or landscape heterogeneity, and pretty significant that it's the flatter landscapes that have fish in more of their wetlands. So that's probably the main thing going on. So if you go, so if you survey all the ponds in the preserve here, most of them are not going to have fish because there's rolling hills between them. Even if it floods a lot, they're not going to attach to one another. But if you go to the coast of South Carolina, almost all their ponds, all their wetlands are going to have fish. It's very hard to find one that doesn't have fish. So
Okay.
that's good. That's the primary thing. In certain regions, you're going to have certain other things taking over. So if you go to Maine, almost all your ponds and wetlands are going to have trout in them, and that's because people spread them around. But kind of on a global scale, a lot of it's flooding.
So we had a drought last year.
Yeah.
Probably all but 2 of those ponds pretty much dried up.
Okay. That
So-
explains the tiny tiger salamanders. Was this last between when I was here last? So since when I was here last?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, they filled up again
Yeah.
this year, but so are we going to expect much difference in the species that are there, or did all those bullfrogs just hide, or?
Most of the time, so a lot of these species can estivate. They'll get down in the mud and just basically sleep it off. Sometimes there is a the communities will change a little bit, but that's kind of a short-term perturbation. What we actually see oftentimes is after the drought, if you have a lot of wetlands with fish, the fish get reduced. Even in the ponds that had fish, even if they didn't dry completely, there's still a lot of fish that are going to die because there's less habitat there. And so when the water comes back up, oftentimes you'll have a better insect and amphibian year after that because there's all of a sudden all this open habitat. There are a few species that need what we would call like long hydroperiod sites in order to reproduce. So in other words, like you have species like up here it would be crawfish frogs that need like 10, 11 months to mature from a tadpole to an adult size. And so if you don't have wetlands that, or if you have a drought where that cycle is interrupted and they're not holding water that long, a lot of times they can be reduced by big droughts like that. Bullfrogs, green frogs can be the same way, but it's actually kind of cool. They can have a physiological response. If they're stressed or if their water is being reduced, they'll actually start metamorphosizing early. I had an experiment going with one of my students over the summer, and we had these tanks, these 15 like cattle tanks to do experiments with some of these frogs, but we introduced fish to help control the mosquitoes, but the fish stressed the frogs out, so they all metamorphosized way early, like 2 months earlier than they should have. So we have these little froglets jumping around everywhere. Yeah.
Speaking of droughts and at least variation on the theme of estivating, I was a natural resource manager for the Air Force and thus know about little areas all over the country. There's fairy shrimp and such are major in like California and such. Are there any fairy shrimp around here?
I don't know specifically in Illinois. I know along the East Coast where you have like vernal pool habitat, they're pretty common. I don't know if there are species in like these, they're usually associated with like closed canopy habitats in the East. So perhaps farther north in Illinois where you do have like a vernal pool type situation, I would be surprised if they weren't there. I don't know about prairie ponds though. They're super cool though when you see them. You're like walking along, and I never expect them when I'm seeing them. I'm like, there's a shrimp in this like 10-foot wide pond.
Yeah, well, fairy
guys.
shrimp out around Travis Air Force Base. You walk in the summer around a vernal pool, and there's just these little silver flakes all over the place. And
Okay.
That's fairy shrimp.
Gotcha. That's awesome. They're never abundant in wetlands here. Like I usually just see them in 1s and 2s, but yeah, I don't know specifically if they're like here. Yeah.
Do you think like the more mobile creatures, like the frogs and the dragonflies and such, do you think they stay pond specific throughout their life, or do you think the individuals might migrate to other ponds?
Yeah, that's a great question. They are going to mostly have pretty high what we would call site fidelity, so they're going to stay, unless, if there's a drought or something, that'll obviously encourage them to move on. They've done some studies where, for most amphibians that I've seen the research on, like 5 to 10% will be kind of the ones that aren't homebodies that'll go and find new habitats to colonize, but then most of the other ones will stay nearby, which is, when you think about it, is a really good strategy over long periods of time. If you're not all staying in the same place.
Right.
Some of you are going out, so if the future is like the present, your 90% that stay home are going to be great. But if the future is not like the present and things are drier or something like that, then the ones that are vagrant and moving around are going to be the ones that, or if new habitats being created, those are going to be the ones that are the most successful. So it's a really good strategy through time. There's been a lot of work done with eastern newts with that, which we found here. Yeah.
When you're done with your doctorate, are you planning to focus on something particular, or just continue to do wetlands in general?
Yeah, I think I'll stick with wetlands. So I teach where I teach at Montreat College. It's a small college, only 600 students, so I kind of have to do everything. So I'll probably continue to do wetland specific research, but it's really fun because I get undergrads that do research, so I also get to focus on some of the areas they focus on. Like I've got a student now that's doing plant stuff. I've had students in the past work with alligators, so I get to kind of branch out quite a bit, which is really fun and really challenging and nice. So yeah.
Given the recent legislative changes again to our definitions of wetlands, do you happen, and your focus on isolated wetlands, are you doing anything on the legislative side?
No, I usually try to stay out of it. A lot of states, since the changes in the Clean Water Act, are making changes on a state-by-state level, which is nice. And they're added protection if those protections come back. But like North Carolina does a pretty good job at protecting isolated wetlands. But yeah, so they were, for those that don't know, they changed the definition of wetlands so that's only along navigable waters, so like floodplain wetlands and that sort of thing, and not necessarily these isolated habitats.
Well, you have to have an overland connection
Yeah,
for it to be a wetland now.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, even though these isolated ones are probably more important for biodiversity, but, yeah. Any other questions?
So are you doing specific things down Snake Road or just?
No, this is actually, it's a school trip, but not a school trip because with the hurricane hit and the institution I'm teaching at, the heavy flooding, we lost 2-3 bridges going into town, and so we are still technically off of school. But I emailed all my students that were in the class and was like, well, I'm still going. I'm not going to teach anything, but if you want to come and see a bunch of snakes, and so 9 of them decided, yeah, we're going to come along and pay for our own gas, and we're just going to walk around and see stuff. So.
Okay,
So.
you're not doing any little research projects? or
No. I've done a little bit around Snake Road in the past, but just working on my dissertation at the same time. I would love to do a whole bunch of other projects, and I am doing a whole bunch of other projects, but I also have to practice self-control so I can finish writing. So I've got three publications that I'm working on. One of them is about ready to be submitted, and the other 2 are just in outlines based on and we're shooting for some of the bigger journals because these are these are questions that are long-standing that there hasn't been much published about, like how do fish arrive, and what are these big effects of fish on everything else. So it's a lot of work this semester. and I already have other things that I'm like, I wanna do this and this and this, but I need to, my wife looks at me and I think twice, and so far I've said no to most new stuff. It's
So how
time.
did you get here? 40's still closed, right?
What's that?
40's still closed for a long time, right?
Yes, yeah, yeah, we ended up having to go 40 east to 77 to 81. It took us about 3 extra hours. It's usually about 7, 8 hours. It was 10, 11, 12, something like that. It was a rough drive up here, but oh well. I had to get here.
Anybody have any other questions?
Appreciate you making the trip and good luck to your community.
Yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
thank you. Appreciate you guys coming. Yeah, sorry, didn't have a little bit more, but like I said, I didn't have a chance to dry run without an internet connection and without a ability to run through it. But I'll hang around for a couple minutes if anybody else has any other questions about anything. So.
Thank you,
for
Josh.
taking your time.